Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here, finally, with another installment of the History of Iron Bombing podcast. My apologies for the fact that it's taken so long. I won't go into the reasons, since they're all basically personal. I think now, though, that I should be able to get back to producing more of these. I've waited to start again until I thought I could do it consistently. That's thanks in part to the supportive comments of members of my Discord channel. I decided I really should keep this going. So, today we have Moving Mud, episode 27, Getting Ready for the Next Round. Now, I'm sure many of you have been following this series, but just in case it's been a while since you listened to one, let me remind you of where we are and how we got here. For the last, 10 episodes or so, we've been in country in Vietnam, charting the course of the air war there. To be fair, we haven't spent a lot of time in Vietnam. We've been in Thailand with the United States Air Force and in the Gulf of Tonkin with the Navy, but we have mostly been over Vietnam. Now, as we discussed in those earlier episodes, the United States entered the Vietnam War with neither the aircraft nor the doctrine nor the training that was really suited to the war that they were going to be expected to fight, because during the 1950s, the focus for all of U.S. air power had been the ability to deliver a massive retaliation nuclear strike in response to any communist aggression. In other words, the United States air power was supposed to provide the threat of delivering a knockout nuclear blow against the Soviet heartland after any military provocation of any kind. Now, not surprisingly, U.S. air doctrine focused, therefore, on strategic bombers and also on high-speed, high-altitude interceptors that could intercept Soviet bombers. Now, that was mainly what the Air Force was responsible for. The United States Navy, they basically continued to fight a bit of a rearguard action to preserve its carrier force. Now, with the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the U.S. was forced to give up on the doctrine of massive retaliation in the face of increasing Soviet ability to conduct its own nuclear strike, regardless of how massive the U.S. strike was. So, the doctrine of massive retaliation was replaced by flexible response, in which the U.S. air power became part of the nuclear triad of ICBMs, land-based bombers, and sea-based ballistic missile submarines. At the end of the day, though, it meant that the only real role, through the 1950s and early 60s, the only real role for tactical air power, for fighter bombers, was to execute deep penetration nuclear strike missions against Soviet air bases and air defense nodes. These were to be high-speed, low-level missions in which accurate delivery of the payload meant getting it within, a few hundred meters of the center of the target. I should also point out that there was really not a whole lot of focus on survivability. Or if there was, it was really only up until the point where the payload was delivered. It's fair to say that most pilots and most of their leadership accepted that life expectancy in a nuclear conflict was pretty much one mission, maybe two. So, in the past few episodes, we've talked about how that colored not only the tactical air-powered doctrine of the U.S., but also the aircraft they flew and the way pilots were trained. So when those same pilots were confronted with an air campaign that, after its initial stages, became one that featured high-level ingress in disciplined formations, significant and increasingly lethal AAA defenses of all calibers, and the new threat in the form of SAMs, as well as a small but active enemy air force, which used home field advantage to good effect, it was a bit of a shock. And then add to the fact that the pilots were expected to fly dozens or even hundreds of missions, meaning that survivability was a very significant factor. Well, it just wasn't the war that anyone showed up being trained to fight. And, as we've talked about, the command, control, and personnel arrangements were, dysfunctional is being kind. But let's say dysfunctional, from top to bottom. And it made adapting to the reality on the ground or in the air, problematic. So it's not surprising that most accounts of the conflict focus on this dysfunction as being the primary reason why the Air Force and the Navy performed, frankly, poorly in Operation Rolling Thunder. And I don't mean poorly in the sense that the pilots did not fly well. I mean that the effects that the Navy and the Air Force were able to achieve simply didn't live up to their own expectations. So, as we've talked about, I don't think that reading of history is entirely fair. I really don't buy the lions led by donkeys narrative that is common, to the point of having become almost received wisdom at this point. It's unfortunate that it is, because I think subscribing to that notion actually gets in the way of learning the truly valuable lessons of the early air war experiences that both the Navy and the Air Force assimilated to some extent. In particular, it gets in the way of coming to grips with the one fundamental myth which has been embedded in air power culture since the 1930s, and that is that air power can be used to achieve purely political aims, that overwhelming air power can effectively bring an opponent to their knees, or at least to the bargaining table. I mean, I think this doctrine has been flawed since the beginning. Even in World War II, it wasn't really proven to be the case. Unfortunately, that outcome was obscured by the fact that the one time it did work was the dropping of the atomic bomb, and this fact and the adoption of massive retaliation as a doctrine basically convinced advocates that air power was strategic in ways that other arms were not. The whole Rolling Thunder campaign had been built on this belief that despite the evidence to the contrary, this belief was firmly maintained at the high levels of the military and passed on to civilian leadership. And that was the belief that air power could be used alone to bring an opponent to the bargaining table. In fact, the Rolling Thunder campaign was halted specifically because there was fear that it would be too effective. There continued to be a genuine fear that the use of massive U.S. air power would provide an excuse for the Soviet Union or Communist China to intervene on behalf of North Vietnam. And so even though Rolling Thunder was not having the intended effect, bombing was halted in the hope that the North Vietnamese leadership would be so relieved that they would come to the negotiating table rather than risking it being restarted. This was a vain hope. At the sharp end, that kind of thinking was really kind of beyond the concern of aircrew who were being put in harm's way, though, and the commanders who put them there. At the sharp end, it was pretty clear that Rolling Thunder had not been successful. To put it bluntly, the effects that were gained were not worth the losses that were being suffered. And there was a real desire to fix that imbalance, both by reducing the cost and increasing the effectiveness. There were actually several areas in which genuine progress was made towards the end of Rolling Thunder, and certainly after Rolling Thunder ended. The first one, and one which is maybe often overlooked, is just the area of logistics. I mean, perfecting the art of delivering more effect with less effort at the pointy end. Now, this has been one of the United States' strengths, well, really since World War II, but in the early days of Rolling Thunder, the U.S. really perfected the art of keeping a large air force at high readiness over a long period of time, which is a skill that not many countries have actually perfected to this day. This not only included the logistical tail back to the United States that thickened dramatically over the course of the war, but also significant improvement and significantly more effort was being spent on ground control and electronic warfare intelligence, both gathering and dissemination, to get aircraft where they would do the most good. And there was also a massive ramp up in the dependence of and deployment of and dependence on air-to-air refueling, which part of Vietnam had more or less been in its infancy, but by the end of Rolling Thunder, a detailed air-to-air refueling plan was an important part of every day's operations for both the Air Force and the Navy. And in fact, the Navy spent quite a bit of time perfecting the art of buddy refueling so that aircraft that were not originally designed as tankers could carry excess fuel and transfer it to those in need. This dependence on air-to-air refueling and making it a central part of the air plan is really, again, something that continues to this day. Now, as I said, in some ways these efforts were so effective that they've largely been ignored in the popular histories. But there's no doubt in my mind that the lessons learned during Rolling Thunder have gone on to be applied over and over again and have allowed the United States, arguably, to become the only major power that is really capable of engaging in expeditionary warfare on any scale. The next need that was uppermost in the minds of those with firsthand experience of combat over Vietnam was the need for better aircraft, frankly. And by that I mean aircraft that were better suited to the tasks they actually had to perform in the environment in which they had to perform them. I think it's pretty clear that the mainstays of the U.S. Air Force, particularly those assigned to ground attack roles, at the start of the conflict were either obsolete or on the verge of being so. In fact, if we look at those airframes assigned to bombing roles, the F-100, the F-105, the A-1, and the A-4, none of them, with the exception of maybe the A-1, funnily enough, would survive the conflict in frontline roles. And in fact, all of them had been relegated to backup or legacy status by the start of the next major phase of air combat, the linebacker operations. Now, all the FUD heads, HUD honeys, and scooter boys and spatiols out there, just to settle down. I'm not casting dispersion and disrespect on your beloved aircraft. This has nothing to do at all with their iconic status, or in some cases like the A4, their longevity and continued participation in armed conflict. What I'm saying is that by 1968, pilots on the front line, if they were honest, knew that as much as they loved their rides, they were just not up to the job that was being asked of them. Pilots and their leadership began advocating pretty early in the process for a significant improvement in performance in two fundamental areas. One had to do with the design of the aircraft itself, and the other had to do with the design of the avionics with which the airframe was stuffed. We'll talk about the aircraft part, and today we'll probably have to wait till next time to start talking about the avionics. What it came down to is that the concerns revolved around two kind of interconnected issues, survivability and effectiveness, basically. The initial aircraft that pilots were given, the ones that they started Rolling Thunder with, were simply not as effective at achieving results on the ground in a way that kept their pilots safe enough to give them confidence to go out and keep doing it every day. In the first case, the basic shortcoming of the early jet fighter bombers, the F-100, the 105, the A-4, was actually pretty simply payload. I mean, while the F-105 and the A-4 were capable of carrying what seemed like a very heavy weight of ordnance, and it's an oft-repeated fact that the A-4's bomb-carrying capacity exceeded the B-17s during the Second World War, there was really a genuine hunger amongst the pilots to be able to carry more, and particularly more heavier types of bombs. In World War II, probably the most commonly dropped bomb in a tactical situation from a fighter bomber was, a 100 kilogram or 250 pound bomb. By the end of the Korean War, that had probably moved up to the 500 pound variety. But after a bit of experience, even those bombs of that magnitude, which basically the Mark 82 500-pound bombs, were seen as being far too light to be used against hard targets, and while also being kind of too heavy, at least in their low drag form, and the delayed fuse versions, they were just too heavy to be used against soft targets. By which I mean against bridges, bunkers, hardened structures. The Mark 82s just kind of bounced off. They've literally been described that way. But against soft targets, above ground targets, these bombs basically buried themselves in the earth and wasted a lot of their killing power digging holes in the ground instead of digging holes in the enemy. So to address the former problem, heavier bombs were needed. To address the second problem, a better means of distributing that lethal effect over a larger area, rather than in delivering it far more precisely was needed. So the need for precision we're going to deal with next time. But the other two solutions required more payload capacity, either to carry a greater quantity of the heavy bombs like the Mark 83 and Mark 84, 1,000 to 2,000 pound bombs, or a much, much larger quantity of high drag bombs that could basically be sprinkled over an area so as to blanket it with lethal effect. So this feeling about the really inadequacy of the payload of the 105 and the A4, I think was kind of reinforced when the first new designs, the F4 and the A6, started to enter service during Rolling Thunder. These aircraft had much higher payload capacity, both in terms of total weight of ordnance and number of bombs that could be carried. Now, note that the 105 did have a pretty decent payload carrying capacity, but it had a really limited number of external pylons some of which were needed for dedicated external fuel tanks and maybe even for jamming pods. And the internal bomb bay was not used because it was designed for a nuclear payload. As a result, the 105s often carried maybe a rack of 6 Mark 82s on the center pylon, a couple more bombs, maybe just Mark 82s or maybe Mark 83s on the wings. But its effective payload was, around 5,000 pounds. Similarly, the A4 was rated for 10,000 pounds, but again, the lack of pylons and the need to carry more gas frequently reduced it to around the same amount, 5,000. Now, the A6 and the F4, by contrast, were rated for almost 18,000 pounds of payload, and with far more pylon space they did not sacrifice as much for carrying some extra gas, so they could probably carry as much as 12,000 pounds and still have room for the gas tanks. So by the end of Rolling Thunder, the Thud and the Scooter guys were looking over at their counterparts with a certain amount of envy, and commanders on site were agitating for more aircraft with higher payloads, at least partly just so that they could reach the tonnage targets they were looking for with fewer sorties. As a result, for the designs that were still progressing through the procurement process, when planning the next round of the fight, both the Navy and the Air Force planned to go into it with a lot more punch per airframe if they could. Now, for the Air Force, this meant replacing the Thuds with Phantoms in the attack role. For the Navy, this meant getting the A6 fully in service, replacing the A1 in the heavy attack role, sometimes even replacing one of the medium attack squadrons with an A6 equipped heavy squadron, possibly using the F4s sometimes in the ground attack role, although I get differing stories, but I don't really think this was common in the Navy. It was common in the Marines, though. It also did mean getting the A7 into service to replace the A4 in the medium attack role, because it had a much higher payload capacity and many more underwing pylons. Now, in addition to being able to deliver more ordnance in any given strike, the other thing that pilots and frontline leadership craved was the ability to deliver it more reliably regardless of the time of day and the weather. They also wanted a greater ability to penetrate air defenses at low level while navigating precisely. These features were both highly desirable to increase both survivability and effectiveness. There was a dawning realization amongst frontline pilots that one of the things that limited the effectiveness of the whole bombing campaign was the fact that the frequent bouts of bad weather meant they just couldn't reliably keep pressure on the enemy. Disrupting and eventually destroying infrastructure on the ground could not be accomplished with a single strike because North Vietnamese had gotten very good at repairing and replacing and working around damaged areas. To really be effective, it was necessary to keep the pressure on, to disrupt the repair and replacement, or to make the damage so extensive that repair services were just overwhelmed. But of course, every time the weather closed in, it prevented the strikes from getting through, but it did not prevent the repair and recovery work from happening. And so it was very much a question of making 2 steps forward in good weather and then 1.5 or 2 steps back when the weather closed in. In addition to that, the bad flying conditions were, in effect, also when pilots kind of wanted to fly, because limited visibility due to weather or darkness or both actually worked against the defenses as well. It took air-to-air interception off the table entirely, and it certainly compromised the effectiveness of low-caliber AAA, which still depended to some extent from visual spotting for its terminal guidance. In effect, mastery of the electronic spectrum, which is what would be necessary in order to give the U.S. aircraft an all-weather capability, mastery of the electronic spectrum should have been one area in which the U.S. was able to dominate their opposition. Because just as the U.S. aircraft industry had led the world in mastery of the technologies and techniques necessary to build supersonic jet aircraft in the 1950s, so the U.S. electronics industry was well ahead of the competition in terms of adopting and developing solid-state electronics, which is really what enabled the next great evolution in aircraft design, where aircraft went from being a sophisticated piece of mechanical engineering to being a platform to host sophisticated avionics and sensor systems. Now, by 1965, that revolution was underway. But to me, I think the experience of Rolling Thunder, which was really the first modern air combat campaign, was the moment when the penny really finally dropped. I think that's the moment when the visionaries, at least, realized that the way to beat their opponents was going to be to outthink them and not just to outfly them, or rather, I should say, outthink and outsense them and not just outfly them. And you know what? I kind of think that's a good place to leave the narrative for now. Next time on the History of Iron Bombing podcast, we're going to start talking about how the revolution in avionics and electronics really did spawn a revolution in air combat. And here's a hint for you. In some ways, Rolling Thunder really was the beginning of the end of the iron bombing era. It was pretty much the last time that pilots dropped dumb bombs unaided by anything other than a simple sight. And just to be clear, I'm not planning to end the podcast here, but the title of the podcast, The History of Iron Bombing, is probably going to become a little less and less applicable as we go forward. At any rate, sorry it has been so long. Thanks for sticking with me. Thanks for listening to this episode, and we'll talk to you again soon.